That's really what he was going at there. The television program, though, and the plain truth, they didn't want to sound that alarm anymore. So they turned off the alarm bells, basically, and then started to really put down the approach that Mr. Armstrong took. They started to really put down the boldness that he spoke with. They started to put down the prophecies that he taught and expounded upon over the course of his ministry. As I said, anyone familiar with it, if you're trying to hold on to Mr. Armstrong's teachings, that is, finds this history to be very sad and somewhat painful. This is from a PGR, a Pastor General's report from December of 1990. All of these quotes taken from the last part of 1990. And here again, he's not only talking about the changes that they were making, but at that time, this had been a year after the establishment of the Philadelphia Church of God. As small as it was, we had by this point sent out a few thousand copies of Malachi's message, and it was waking people up, some of them, a few, in a few congregations, mostly here in the United States at the time. But in this PGR, he talked about those that were leaving the church, a few, following a minister or two who were, as he said, believing every word of Mystery of the Ages. Imagine that, believing Mystery of the Ages. This was something that the church had proudly distributed right at the time of Mr. Armstrong's death. And now those leaving were to be criticized for trying to hold on to it, that's all. Trying to hold on to what was in Mystery of the Ages. He says, along with every word of every article and booklet Mr. Armstrong wrote, except those they are personally aware that he specifically changed himself. It's not to say that everything Mr. Armstrong said over the course of 50-some years is spot on. He made his mistakes and admitted so. But this is what we were accused of early on, that every single word that Mr. Armstrong said was the Bible, as far as we were concerned. And that's not a true statement at all. But then he went on and talked about how that these people bolster their arguments as they leave the Worldwide Church of God by saying how that the Worldwide Church had gone from Philadelphian to a Laodicean spirit. Now I'll leave this to you to study over in Revelation 3, the truth there about the church eras, the Philadelphian work, known for its work, known for going through open doors, known for walking by faith, known for following Christ. And then the Laodicean era, which is characterized by a spirit of lukewarmness, of self-righteousness, of self-reliance, of apathy, and really just a half-hearted type of effort. Well, going back to some of the ways the ministers were targeting this little church as it started back in 1990, actually at the last part of 1989. This is from a sermon another minister gave, Dean Blackwell, on May 4th, 1991. And in this message, he talked about all the splinter groups that had broken away from the Worldwide Church of God, and we were, of course, lumped right into them. He said there were 23 of them, and that all of them had not amounted to anything. They just all basically faded away over time. He says, do you think a little group of 135 people is going to grow big enough to preach the gospel of the kingdom around the world for a witness when they say Christ is coming back soon, Christ's coming is imminent? Do you think a little group's going to be able to do a worldwide work? He says, to me, one of the greatest blessings I've had in my job has been to go out into troubled areas when something like this happens and see if I can shut the door in the wolf's face, he said. I hate to see God's people blinded and duped and deceived and hoodwinked and led off into a little fly-by-night peanut shell floating on a big ocean, going nowhere, doing nothing. Now, back then, when we heard that at the time, it was quite a motivating comment for us to hear. Of course, it doesn't matter really in the end what men think. All that matters is where was God? Where was God's work? But here again, you have the advantage now of hindsight in looking back on that comment. Where is a little group of 100 or 200 people going to be able to go? What kind of a work will they be able to do? And as I said at the time, the Worldwide Church was just cresting at this peak. that it had risen to because of the momentum that Mr. Armstrong's work had given it those first few years after his death. We've covered before on this program Matthew 7. I mean, it is, you should look to fruits. You should judge by fruits. Now, those things aren't just going to emerge overnight. It doesn't happen that way on a fruit tree. I mean, when you plant the seed, you've got to go through the time, the months, the years, before it ever even starts to produce visible fruit. Now, with what's happened in the last 21 years, what you've seen, if you followed this work, if you followed the key of David, starting back in a small way in 1993, or radio before that in 1992, or the Trumpet magazine, which came out just in a little newsletter format in 1990, or any of the other things, the youth camp that we started in the 90s, and then the college in 2001, and then the other publications along the way, the books, the booklets. You know about the lawsuit. We'll talk about that a little bit at the end of the program today with the Raising the Ruins offer. All of these things, I mean, they took time, and it was a difficult process to go through. But look at Mr. Armstrong's work. Look at how he began back in 1933, 1934. Just a little 15-minute radio program once a week. And it grew and it spread from there. And then he saw it not so much as a work just in Oregon, but something that would expand to cover the entire Northwest. The Northwest of the United States. It seems funny now to even say that, because by the time he died, I mean, he was going around the world with God's message, with the gospel message of the kingdom of God. It's easy when it's small to look down on that effort, to despise the day of small beginnings in the worldwide news. It was I think it was 1991, in the middle of 91, it was the first time that they referred to Malachi's message. This was about 18 months after the PCG started. So you can see that it gradually became something that they had to deal with more aggressively, more openly in a personal, back then. This is June of 1991. Mr. DeKoch talked about these former ministers who had left, and he says, one dissident says, "I'm destroying everything Mr. Armstrong did. In fact, I'm doing exactly the same thing Mr. Armstrong did." That seems almost laughable to say that today when you see what's happened, how many changes that they had already made that were obvious in 1991, and that became clear by the time that Mr. DeKoch Jr., his son, put out his book, I believe in 1997. Going back to that quote from Mr. Waterhouse, 1992, the snow flurry comment. Mr. Waterhouse, by the way, had been known for many years in the church as a traveling evangelist, and he went around after the church experienced a lot of trouble and turmoil in the 1970s to really revive a spirit of support and enthusiasm for Mr. Armstrong, his office, and the work that the church was doing. And he had a profound impact on the church at large. I mean, the worldwide church, as he went around and visited all these areas. Now, after Mr. Armstrong died, he tried to do those same things. He tried to have that same kind of an impact to drum up support for Mr. DeKoch and his administration. But where he lost credibility, Mr. Waterhouse that is when he tried to uphold the very things that he denounced previously. He was conflicted, and you could see it in the weakness of his messages. Later on, this is from that sermon, after he talks about the snow flurry and how it would melt away, he says, "I want to make a strong point here. You need to grasp what people are hoodwinked by Satan the devil on. I know Gerald Flurry very well. I thought I did. I didn't know some of the things he was doing behind the scenes, but he was never around Mr. Armstrong's feet to be trained there. I was with Wayne Cole," he says. "We sent him up to Washington when I was with Wayne Cole in 1975. When the decision was made to send him, he was serving not in Pasadena, he was serving in Norwalk. We sent him up to Washington to handle those four churches." That's where he was for about 10 or 11 years. Then he went to Oklahoma City. Notice this point that he concludes with. How could he carry on for Mr. Armstrong? He wasn't even trained around him, much less at his feet. Wasn't even trained close to him. wasn't even trained at his coattail, wasn't trained within arm's reach. He was miles away for about 13 or 14 years. Whom did God appoint to carry on for Moses? One trained at his feet, Joshua. That's the smart way to do it. That's the smart way, he said. Now think about that quote, and already how the thinking had changed in so many of those top ministers, where they talked about how that the only logical way that it could happen is if it's Mr. Armstrong hand-selecting someone who is right there alongside of him, as if an assistant can never go bad. Look at all of the examples. I mean, even the very minister he mentioned that he was with in the 70s, he left the church long before Mr. Armstrong died. And I could give you a list of perhaps 20, 30, 40, 50 other ministers, well-known ministers who taught at Ambassador College, who were right there alongside Mr. Armstrong, but who left the church before Mr. Armstrong died. And then you look at what happened after he died. Look at the examples, one after another after another. Look at Lucifer, for example. He was right there at God's throne room. He was right there assisting God the Father in God's throne room. And still, he got out and on his own. Now, contrast that with some of the other ones in the Bible. Amos, who came out of nowhere, a farmer, to be a prophet. Look at the example of Moses, who made all kinds of excuses before he finally accepted God's charge. Look at the example of Paul or King David. And even, as I said, Mr. Armstrong himself. If you go back to the start of Mr. Armstrong's work, as impressive and as visible as it was in 1985, it wasn't that way in 1935. Now, much of this history, as I've pointed out to you before, is told in this book, Raising the Ruins. You can see a picture there of Mr. Armstrong on the cover, raising the ruins of the work that did have a mustard seed beginning back in the 1930s, but it kept growing and producing, and eventually producing all kinds of fruit. And as small as the beginning was for us back in 1990, back in the end of 1989, it did keep growing and producing, and now we're seeing so many of the fruits more visibly. You need to call the number on your screen and get your own copy of this book. I mean, this is the kind of book we're probably going to advertise on this program every few weeks or so, just to make you aware of it, just to encourage you, if you haven't called for it before, to get it this time, or perhaps to convince you as a new viewer to get this copy. It's free. It's 300-400 pages of material, hardcover, free of charge. We'll pay for the postage, we'll pay for the phone call, because we want for you to read this history. Some of it, as I said, is painful to go through, particularly if you were familiar with that church during the days of Mr. Armstrong. If you weren't, you're going to be shocked at how much that church was given and how quickly they turned away from that truth, how quickly they just let it go. Call now and get your own copy of this book, and along with it, we'd also like to remind you of the Trumpet Daily website, where you can watch these programs again and also download other PDF free offers that we make available just on the website. So thank you for joining us today, and we'll look forward to seeing you again tomorrow morning.